I'm Megan Montgomery from NCBFAA, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's presentation. I'd like to mention that, as always, all attendees are in listen-only mode. However, you can submit written questions at any time, which we will answer at the end as time permits. We will also be sending out a PDF copy of the presentation at the conclusion of this webinar. Excited to welcome our panel of expert speakers for our presentation today. John Kent of Kent & O'Connor is NCBFAA's legislative representative and expert on politics and government. Charles Riley of John A. Steer Company is our legislative committee chair and strong contributor to our government affairs program. We are excited to have them both with us today, and so without further delay, I will get things started and turn the program over to John.
Hi, everybody. These are exciting times in Washington. It's an exciting week, and Friday will be an exciting day. We see democracy in action, where we turn over the reins of government to an entirely new set of agenda, and this is certainly no exception this week. A lot of people are on the call on the webinar because they want to know what's going to happen. And that question is being shared by the so-called Washington insiders these days who don't know what's going to happen. We've seen just an extraordinary amount of points of view being tweeted, being released. We have nothing really substantial to say about where it's going. We see so many discordant mixed messages that we really have to sort of take stock in kind of an undercover investigator kind of way. We sort through data and decide what that all means. So we may need a follow-up session, a webinar, when we get down to the questions that maybe are foremost on your minds, which are, what's Customs going to do, what's FMC going to do, who are the people, what's their agenda. But that hasn't taken shape, nor has really their trade policy formed at this point. So let me start at the very beginning, that everybody is wondering where things are going, what will happen, and that question is being shared by the Washington so-called insider community that is hearing a great number of mixed messages, different signals, and none of them sort of creating a straight line pattern for people to follow so that they can speak with any assurance as to what will happen. But for purposes of today, we're going to talk about trade in general, because you deal with the over the top problem, the general questions, and then you get down into where does customs policy take us at some later time when that administration, when those administration personnel are appointed and in place. So let's just take that first slide. In the land of Trump trade, what we're talking about there nowadays is we've done a U-turn on how we discuss trade. Economic nationalism refers to an America first as a first consideration when we talk about trade, rather than sort of a global how do we all work together kind of approach. And so we're looking at things, the administration is going to look at things through a prism that says what works best for America, and then how does the rest of the world fit into that equation. It does indeed upend the free trade versus protectionist battle lines. I don't know that anyone can fall on either side with certainty. I know that we, within our community, like to see as much trade as possible, and perhaps in the end we will see a great deal of trade, but we don't know yet. We don't know the rules of the game. Next slide, please. So the picture here are the two principal directors from the White House of trade policy. Steve Bannon is on your left. Reince Priebus is on your right. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So Steve Bannon is the chief strategist. He's the idea man. And just to give you some background on him, he's ultra-conservative. He launched a news site, which is called Breitbart, and extremely controversial. It separates Trump and his points of view from the Republican establishment. It sort of set a direction that was good for the campaign. And now that the campaign is over and he's subordinate to Donald Trump, it remains to be seen how vocal he is and how persuasive he will be in the long term. But he is one of the two principal spokespeople and staff people in the White House. Reince Priebus got a lot of publicity during the campaign, and largely because he kept things together. He was chairman of the RNC. He was being tugged at from all sides. He had to answer for Republicans, office holders, and news media as to why their views might be discordant with the Trump campaign. And in the end, I think he developed a calm about him that kept the RNC certainly functioning. His background was that he was a chair of the Wisconsin Republican Party, and he has ties to Ryan and Scott Walker in Wisconsin. So there's a view here that he is sort of Mr. Inside, and that Steve Bannon is Mr. Outside. Let's have the next slide, please. Another personality that will take a lead role, we'll have his confirmation hearing tomorrow, and we'll see what he says in order to get himself extricated from some of the controversy that attaches to him. But he emerged during the campaign as a major donor and a prolific defender of Trump in the media, wrote a great number of stories that defended Trump and criticized Hillary Clinton. Next slide, please. So who's Wilbur Ross? I mean, he's part of the number of folk that have been brought in from Wall Street. He's not a typical Wall Streeter. He's a financier, turnaround artist. Of great importance is that he is had been an exponent of the steel and textile manufacturers. And those of you who are familiar with past trade policy know their point of view was somewhat different than ours. He called NAFTA the poster child for unbalanced trade and investments. But then again, on the flip side, he supported CAFTA and once favored TPP. He will be a major player as the Secretary of Commerce. And I think his confirmation will take place. I don't think that's in doubt, really. Next slide, please. So more on him. He's had a pragmatist past as a businessman, and you can never be sure that when somebody's a businessman and takes positions, that they'll be the same when it moves into politics. So, but he has been at least comfortable with China, less comfortable as time went on and as the campaign went on. He'll be a central voice in trade. He'll be working with the USTR. He'll be working with the National Trade Council director. More on that to come. He's not been a proponent of tariffs, although he can accept tariffs. And as you know, the campaign was an exponent of tariffs. as a means to stem the flow of imports. Next slide, please. So the other part of this triumvirate is USTR Bob Lighthizer. Lighthizer is a former Senate Finance Chief Staffer and a Deputy USTR, so he's had a wealth of experience. Next slide, please. So who is he? He's been low-key and he's been under the radar, but he's a seasoned trade lawyer. He's done his fair share of work on the other side, dealing with unfair foreign competition. But he knows the tools of trade negotiation. That's what USTR is responsible for, and as a leader both at USTR and as an exponent of trade policy that he'll have to work through with the White House and with his other co-participants. I think that'll be important. Next slide, please. Here's the bottom line. The U.S. has prioritized the ideal of free trade over its own self-interest. So he's firmly in that camp. It's not as though we have a free trader in there, and I think I think you have to put his appointment in perspective. He can bring the establishment with him if he handles it right. But on the other hand, he is not parting company so extremely with others within the administration. Next slide, please. Another personality that you need to know about is Peter Navarro, who will head up the National Trade Council. It's interesting here that the administration will create a National Trade Council to focus on trade, separate and apart from the National Economic Council, which used to have that responsibility and probably still does to a lesser degree. But Navarro is an academic. He was at UC Irvine, ran for office 3 times. He's a policy advisor to the campaign, and his principal forte is economics. So next slide, please. But what has he said? He wrote a book that is pretty inflammatory by its title, anyway, Death by China. He calls China's rulers ruthless and thugs. So he's an anti-China person within this administration, and that's what voice I think they'll hear. Next slide, please. The National Trade Council, again, is been created within the White House, and it'll coordinate among everyone. I think really, if you think about structure, it's likely to be influenced a lot by by Bannon and Priebus, but it'll be a coordination point within the White House, so that the president and others, other executives within the White House, will have a firm hand on the direction of trade policy. I think it's interesting to note his 2 deputy directors, one of whom is a person I've known for a long, long time, who came from the U.S. Chamber, which is not of the same ilk as a great number of the other free trade and anti-trade proponents. He worked on Senate Finance Committee, but he was sort of a mainstream Republican advocate of trade, and I think brings in some of that in the job title. And the job title is clearly, let's focus on America first. So next slide, please. How will the NTC, the National Trade Council, work? Will it facilitate consensus, or will it sort of create direction from the top, coordinating with the president and with his chief advisors in terms of making decisions, or will it sort of be just a part of the package here, part of the Department of Commerce, USTR, triumvirate. Others in the mix, next slide please, are Steve Mnuchin and Gary Cohen. Mnuchin being the Treasury Secretary, Gary Cohen being the NEC Director. Mnuchin is also a Wall Street guy. He's going to face some tough questioning during his hearing, which is coming up, and his selection has got some consequence to CBP and its policy direction. Gary Cohen comes from Goldman Sachs, and the prospect of these two having a great deal of influence is there, but I think it's going to be more at the periphery, and I think they're going to talk about things that affect U.S. economic performance. They're going to be concerned about markets. They're going to be concerned about overall prosperity issues. Next slide, please. So both are non-ideological. They're non-populist. I think the description of both is on your slides there, but they come from another direction. Next slide, please. Let's look at the Congress and the congressional players that are out there. Those are pictures of Kevin Brady, who's chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, and Orrin Hatch, who's chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. It's under their leadership that trade and tax legislation will be shaped, and they're going to be the primary and most influential members of Congress in terms of working with the administration on what Congress can settle for. Next slide, please. There's a little background for you there on Kevin Brady and Orrin Hatch. I think that Brady is the principal proponent in the House of the border adjustment tax, and we'll get to that in a little bit. I'd say that Orrin Hatch is amenable to enforcement issues. He's a very strong proponent of IPR enforcement and rules. He took on forced labor and anti-dumping hardline positions in the last customs bill termed TIFTIA. So I think he's going to be looking for what works within sort of a community in the Senate that looks for consensus rather than direction from outside. Next slide, please. Looking at the congressional Democrats, we've got Richard Neal, who is the ranking Democrat on the Ways and Means Committee, and Ron Wyden, who is the ranking Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee. Next slide, please. Congressman Neal, I've described below for you. I think really telling is the fact that he has assigned some real hardliners to the Trade Subcommittee, and the chairman of that Trade Subcommittee will be Bill Pascrell from New Jersey, who historically has been very pro-labor, very vociferous on issues that relate to free trade, and very strong in his desire for barriers and for brakes on the admissibility of imports. Ron Wyden is a proponent of what he calls smart trade, and smart trade, I guess, is a matter of your own interpretation. He has strong views on some issues, but generally looks to find consensus, as does Senator Hatch, and as do most of the Senate. Next slide, please. I think a very important player will be the Speaker, Paul Ryan. He is the person who has created this better way vision that is inspiring the corporate tax legislation that you're hearing about in the Ways and Means Committee. And I think a real key to the direction of trade will be the willingness of the House and Senate to accept and adopt the views of the administration of that triumvirate, and to enact those policies into law. I think that the Congress is going to be far more independent than we've seen in the past with other presidents of the same party, and I think they're going to be very assertive, and I think they're being assertive insofar as this border trade initiative that they have talked about. So next slide, please. So how are we summing things up? I think there will be three strong centers of power in the administration. I call them a triumvirate, but you don't know if they're co-equal. Certainly they're going to compete. And part of I think the rationale that we've heard about the president-elect is that he likes to see all points of view at tension. He likes to hear debate, and then he likes to call the answer. And I think that what he is looking to do is having people of many diverse points of view, still consistent with his platform, still consistent with his campaign, but nonetheless diverse in how to address issues. And I think that the creation, as I said before, of the NTC is a sign that he wants to be heavily involved in trade policy. Next slide, please. So what to expect? Negotiating a new trade relationship with Mexico. I think that the fact that we have a 2-year NAFTA notice period, that is, that you give notice under the terms of NAFTA, and that you have 2 years to move forward with breaking free of NAFTA or staying with it or modifying it, is largely a point of leverage. From my point of view, I don't think you'll see NAFTA scrapped, but I think it will be used as a means of dealing with Canada and most importantly Mexico insofar as bringing changes into that agreement. I think you'll see very aggressive trade enforcement that'll deal with commodities, that'll deal with what you can import into the United States, and one of the constraints on that importation. I think there'll be a preference for bilateral trade deals. I think you've heard that. They want to include, I've heard right out of the box, they want to get Great Britain to a bilateral trade agreement. The Prime Minister, though, of Britain is saying that she wants to abandon the EU customs union. That being the case, then this whole bilateral trade deal with Britain can happen. Without it, it can't. And so I think that's the pivotal question as to what Britain does before we see what can be done from the U.S. side. Could a rebranded TPP eventually emerge? I think it's highly unlikely. There was a quote this week from a Trump transition person who said that it's dead. I think that Senator Hatch is throwing up a sort of a trial balloon to see what happens, and I think you'll hear the answer fairly quickly and quite adamantly. And then the issue of foremost on our minds, I think, needs to be whether we'll see tariffs or border adjustment tax. Next slide, please. This border adjustment tax occupies only a few lines in the Ryan tax plan. It really has not been fleshed out in any great detail. I've heard an anecdote of someone going to Capitol Hill with his constituency, talking to each of the trade staff in the congressional offices on the House side, and no one really knew what the details were of BAT, and I think that's true. I think there are a few insiders that have that information, and it's simply not been made public, and perhaps not because I think it then provides more flexibility for designing a plan that can get enough votes and get the support of the administration. President-elect Trump told the Wall Street Journal just the other day that it's too complicated, using his words, that the border adjustment tax is too complicated. I think you have to sort of juxtapose that against the proposal to have tariffs, and I think he's sort of comparing the two in his remarks, and he's sort of keeping the tariff idea in play. Next slide. Is the BAT going anywhere? Well, the congressional leadership is adamant, but I think the Senate is unknown, and when you hear negative comments from the administration, from the president-elect, I think you sort of have to sort of sit and wait to see what might happen. Bear in mind that the House bears the initiative, has the initiative under the Constitution for all revenue measures. So putting together this tax plan, this trade plan, will start there, and if they're insistent on a BAT, then it may spring to life and have to be dealt with. Next slide, please. So I think you need to look at congressional Democrats too. I think congressional Democrats may try to protect American workers than Trump on these issues, and may even compose a voting bloc to assist him in the House. Moving on to the next slide. I think the one really key ingredient in all of this policy making is the bully pulpit. And what we've seen from his use of Twitter, from his use of press and media, is that he can reach out to his election day constituency and get them to rally behind him. I've heard tales of congressmen being the subject of a negative Twitter and just being upbraided by their by his constituency. In the past, he always used to send a president out to the hustings, state by state, when you had a major piece of legislation that you wanted to see supported, so that the president could override the attitudes of the inside the Beltway crowd. This, I think, will provide, this electronic means will provide that mechanism to Donald Trump, and we'll have to see how effectively he employs it during the debates on policy. So final slide, please. The nutshell is, and for a moment of good humor, that we're going to have a wild ride on trade, and I think we're just going to have to stay attentive to all the details of what takes place. Thank you very much for listening to me. I again apologize for the delay and my ineptitude with operating the telephone. Charles, have you finished?
Charles, we can't hear you. Did you self-mute?
So maybe we'll move on to questions, huh?
Yes, hello. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Okay, the first set of questions, the first question states, this seems to flip the longtime Republican support for free trade. Is there a danger of splitting the party in half over trade?
I think the party is split in half anyway. I don't think it's yet sort of come to terms completely with the election of a new Republican president. It hasn't aligned itself with with the new president on at least the policy that has been verbalized. And I think that the conventional Republican mainstream feels very separated from the president. But on the other hand, there's nowhere else to go. And so I think there's a rebuilding process that's underway, and we'll have to wait and see how successful it is.
The next question, assuming the border adjustment tax does get approved by both houses and signed by the president, do you think this will start a trade war with our trading partners?
Well, there's an effort to make the BAT sound like the VAT, and you can hear the sounds when you say VAT, the VAT. There's a certain parallel that they have done on purpose. But there is an effort by Congress that this is no different than a result than what we see with the VAT that's in place in many countries, and they'll be making that case. I do believe that there'll be very many disaffected countries who will be unhappy with this, particularly those that are heavy importers, and it remains to be seen what actions they take. A trade war is like shooting yourself in the foot, and so I think that may be of consequence in a remote way. I don't think it's likely short term for sure.
The next question, do you see any of the individuals who have been named as potential secretaries, and I guess I'll add, and particularly any of the individuals that we discussed today here needing Senate confirmation, having problems with their confirmation bid?
Yeah, I think the EPA nominee is a likely target. There's some that have had issues with their holdings. I think those can be overcome and would be negotiated. I think that would include Rex Tillerson. However, I think that while there may be problems, I think they'll be confirmed. I'm not sure whether he'll run the whole board or whether there'll be one or two that fail in that. I think the EPA administrator is the most vulnerable right now.
Does it appear that the administration will take a less harsh approach to our northern border trading partner, Canada? For example, is it likely that the softwood lumber agreement with Canada will be renewed?
Yeah, I can't speak specifically to softwood lumber. I'm reading a lot about it right now, but I can't speak specifically about how they'll address that. I think there are a great number of thorny problems with our trading relationship with Canada. There have been for a long time, but that's because we're so close, and they're certainly our number one trading partner. But on the other hand, I think we have been so close, and our economies are so intertwined. I think if you look at the auto manufacturing process, you see how interconnected trade and those manufacturing techniques, those supply chains have become that I don't think we'll allow it to get out of hand, and I think they may get a free pass.
The next, I'm going to combine two questions into one. The next couple of questions deal with the EU. Is the free trade agreement with the EU, I believe this is referencing TTIP. Is there any hope for that moving forward? And is there any, potentially any impact on the current USTR to assess regulatory tariffs against imports from the EU, specifically with respect to beef, to increase U.S. beef export? I don't know if you want to tackle those separately or together.
Yeah, no, I think we can intertwine them because, frankly, I don't know where they're going to take the issues like beef imports. I think it's way too early to be able to say with any certainty. I think there was a request by Richie Neal, the ranking Democrat, that we take up TTIP again, that we continue to negotiate that. But I think TTIP is a very, very difficult trade agreement to negotiate. I suppose you could say that negotiating with the EU is bilateral. Yeah, it is in some ways. But I think there's so many thorny issues that Europe is adamant about that that's certainly not something that's going to take place in the short term.
Do you have any insight on GSP, what will happen when it comes up for renewal?
No, I mean, there you're looking, if you look at it in a, if you step back and look at it, you're talking about using foreign products, imports in the supply chain. Very necessary to our supply chains these days, very necessary because those products are otherwise unavailable in the U.S., certainly not sufficiently available in the U.S. I think there's every reason to be supportive of GSP and for the administration to continue to support it, but you don't know how it can get tangled up in politics and how it will get branded with being termed sort of a pro-import mechanism. And you don't know whether GSP will end up with barnacles attached to it, add-ons that make it less useful.
With respect to the recent worldwide discussions on the steel glut, and particularly because there is a steel presence in the administration, the incoming administration's cabinet selections, do we have any idea of where the administration will go with that?
We just have to look at the people and what their past positions are, and certainly we can't predict specific direction, no. I don't have any idea, in all candor.
Do you have any insight on any potential impact on the Trump presidency on foreign trade zones?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, there too, I think they're a highly vulnerable organization or an enterprise. I think they're being used in a lot of ways to facilitate importation, and you don't know what level the administration will drop down to in terms of specifically changing the way industries and enterprises like that do business. So I think they're very vulnerable, but I can't tell you where this administration might take that.
Do you have any idea if the new administration will look to renegotiate the reduction of duties under the Information Technology Act, the ITA?
I do not. Sorry, I just have not followed that.
And I think finally I'm going to roll a couple of questions about China into one. There is some quite outlandish tariff rates being levied about at the moment on cars, 33%, those kinds of things. And there's also some potential rumors over Trump's potential personal debt and business interaction with China to the tunes of millions of dollars. Do you have any insight or comment into any of those, any of that kind of behind-the-scenes intrigue?
No, I don't. And I, you know, in doping out how they're going to approach China, I think they'll have, they'll fill the media with quite a lot of concern about China trade and about the downside of China trade. And then I think the rest of it takes place through negotiation, through direct one-on-one discussions with China. I think you've got to always remember that, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way, that President-elect is a deal maker. He looks to negotiate, but he likes to negotiate on his own terms, and he likes to negotiate from strength. And I think in looking at all of these issues that we're confronted right now, deal making is part of that.
Thank you. We are out of time and out of questions. For everyone that that was kind enough to hang in there with us, we really appreciate it. You will be awarded your full CCS CES points. Charles, I know that we've been having some technical difficulty getting you up and going in the speaking. Are you able to get on? Do you have anything you'd like to add before I close the webinar? Okay, well, thank you. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to John and Charles for putting together the webinar today. We will be sending a PDF copy of today's presentation as well as a short survey we'd like you to complete later on today. Thank you again for your participation, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.